As I said, in terms of the War of 1812, you really only need to know the battles that happened in and around the Chesapeake, as well as New Orleans, which actually happens after the war is technically over. But in the summer of 1814, about 4,000 British troops had attacked Washington, D.C. And this is really not surprising. The war had not been going well for the Americans for really the first two-thirds of the war. And the British are particularly pissed off because the Americans had burned the Canadian capital of York. Now, they quote, take no prisoners. So the angry British torched the White House, the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and other government buildings. And this actually is the only time that the U.S. is actually attacked on its soil until 9/11, aside from Pearl Harbor, which is actually, again, a territory at the time in Hawaii. So it's really quite a shock, and Americans are embarrassed and angry, and many of them lose confidence in the government, the military, which wasn't that impressive to begin with. So Madison, who had actually been forced to flee the White House and flee Washington, calls an emergency session of Congress and really pleads with Americans, like, expel the invaders, please help us. Now, a newspaper reports that the spirit of the nation is aroused. And so 50 warships with over 4,000 British soldiers now, they've already attacked D.C., they're going to take on Baltimore. And you've only got about 1,000 American soldiers to protect this place, Fort McHenry, in the port of Baltimore. And famously sort of winning by the dawn's early light, this is Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner around this battle. It's really an important American victory, sort of snatching, victory from the jaws of defeat that everybody thought the Americans couldn't win anything. And after that, the momentum sort of changes. So the British are defeated on Lake Champlain, which is one of the Finger Lakes up near New York, at a battle called Plattsburgh. And then in Florida, there's a win by Andrew Jackson, who we're going to see at New Orleans. So you've got some military momentum that is actually happening after two really poor years of war. But even more so, London merchants want to trade with America. There's been an embargo, there's now been the war, and much like we saw with the Stamp Act and the non-importation going back leading up to the repeal of the Stamp Act, you're going to see this real economic pressure in Britain. And at the same time, Britain sort of looks at this and says, it's not worth the cost. Like, why do we continue to do this? So you're going to actually have the treaty at Ghent, which is in Belgium. And it's classic tie. Like, okay, we're just going to stop. We're going to agree to end the war, return each other's prisoners, restore previous boundaries. Really, sort of as if nothing happened. Now, America at the end didn't get Canada that it wanted, and its capital was destroyed. They did have, obviously, more success in the South. But at the end of the day, they really saved the fragile country and were able to sort of reverse this financial ruin after the war. So did anything positive come about it? Yeah, more than anything, there's going to be really a renewed sense of nationalism that comes from, quote unquote, beating the British. You didn't beat the British, but you tied the British, and tying was as good as a victory. And now you have two wins over the British, really within the span of 40 years, which is pretty remarkable. Now, technically, Andrew Jackson had prepared to fight the British at the very important city of New Orleans before the Treaty of Ghent was even signed, and because it took so long, over a month and a half, for the news from Belgium to the United States, fighting basically just continued. So actually, the Battle of New Orleans happens after the two sides have agreed to stop fighting, but it's still really important because had America lost, perhaps Britain would have thought better of the deal and gone back and tried to change it. But it really is one of those sort of remarkable victories that made a hero out of Andrew Jackson, because he had this sort of ragtag group of Native Americans and mulattoes and just in many cases overmanned, or I should say he was undermanned against, again, this professional fighting force of 8,000 veteran troops that came in. And so when you win, and it wasn't just a win, it was really a lopsided victory, it created a ton of nationalism that sort of supported this tie/victory over Britain, and is going to vault Andrew Jackson into this true sort of American icon status that he will ride to, running in 1824 and almost winning, and then famously winning in 1828, and again for presidency 4 years later in 1832. Now, it's also important to note that the War of 1812 really is considered the end of any Federalist power whatsoever. Now, interestingly, the embargo and the war had really given life to what everyone thought was a dead Federalist Party, because under the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson with the Embargo Act, and then the War of 1812 under Madison, it actually gave life to the Federalists. And so before the Treaty of Ghent, there's actually still going to be a push for the Federalists. They get together at something known as the Hartford Convention. So you're going to get a bunch of states represented, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire. These are truly your New England groups. And they get together and they try to come up with a plan that allows them to sort of make demands that are going to give the Federalist power over the Democratic Republicans. And they, propose a number of amendments that would go to the Constitution that include getting rid of counting of slaves at all in terms of population that would help you with representation in Congress. Remember, it was 3/5. They wanted to get rid of sort of this simple majority that you'd have in Congress and instead have to have a 2/3 vote to admit any new states. Part of that was that they knew that any new states that would come in would be coming out of the Louisiana Purchase, which would be pro-slavery states. They also wanted to limit Congress's ability to have trade embargoes longer than 2 months. Again, trade embargoes that had hurt the Northeast and the Federalists. They wanted to not allow immigrants from holding federal office. Again, going after sort of the people that supported Democratic Republicans. They wanted to limit presidents to 1 term. Well, think about who'd had 2 terms. Washington had 2 terms. Jefferson had 2 terms. At this point, it looks like Madison, might get another term. They also don't want to allow successive presidents from the same state. Now, think about this. We'd had Washington, Virginia. Then, of course, you'd had Adams for 4 years from Massachusetts, but then you'd had Jefferson and Madison, and actually, we're later going to have Monroe after that, also from Virginia. They sort of floated the idea of secession if their demands weren't met. But ultimately, when they bring these demands sort of defiantly to Washington, they find out that not only had we just won at the Battle of New Orleans, but that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. It was sort of a wah, wah, wah moment, and it's truly considered the end for the Federalists. They had their pity party, and it turned out that the country was so busy celebrating this, tie/victory that they will have no power anymore. And in the end, one of the legacies that we have to think about is that Madison had originally been a Federalist and helped write the Constitution, then sort of switched over as he helped write the Bill of Rights, and then became really Jefferson's right-hand man within the Democratic Republican Party. This war sort of helped bring him back to Federalist ideas in a way, one of which he saw just how poor our military was and how defenseless Washington was. So he's going to see a need to increase the size of the military. He's going to see just how poor the economy was and the importance of having a bank. So we're actually going to have the Second Bank of the United States, which is going to get chartered in 1816, another 20-year charter, which is going to be up in 1836, which is going to be really climactic. And overall, you're going to get this, broader sense of nationalism, which is important to think about in terms of a Democratic Republican who really sort of focused on states' rights.